Hello again. It does seem to be rather assumed these days that the empire building and colonialism in which Britain engaged during the 19th century was undertaken for purely greedy and self-interested motives. What is sometimes known as a scramble for Africa is depicted now as a race to see which of the European nations could most outrageously exploit those living in countries such as Sudan. Nothing could be further from the truth, and this idea is a very recent one which has been carefully constructed by left-wing academics and intellectuals. The thumbnail to this video shows a man who epitomises all that such people despise. General Gordon, just before he was killed by dervishes in the Sudanese capital of Khartoum. There's a statue of Gordon in London, just the kind of thing that people would like to see removed these days. I mean, what was he even doing in Khartoum anyway? Typical Victorian imperialist. Well, what was Gordon doing in Sudan? He was trying to put a halt to the slave trade in East Africa, which was responsible for transporting black Africans via Egypt and Yemen to the Ottoman Empire. This was still big business in the late 19th century, and the British detested what was going on. Born in 1833, George Gordon was a very complicated character. He was a career soldier in the British Army. He was also a devout Christian and a vowed celibate. He never married, feeling himself called instead to higher things. After serving in the Crimean War from 1855, Gordon returned to England and then, at the request of the ruler of Egypt, went to Sudan on behalf of the British Army to try and break up the slave trade there. He prosecuted the campaign against the Arab slave traders with vigour, intercepting slave caravans and freeing the slaves. The traders he arrested and dispatched to prison. Gordon's strength lay in the fact that he was not only quite incorruptible, but also possessed of an immense and immovable conviction that he was doing God's work by putting an end to the slave trade. He eventually had a nervous breakdown through stress and returned to Britain in 1880. The people in Sudan were very annoyed at what they saw as unwarranted interference in their traditional way of life, and the attempts by the British to suppress slavery resulted in a revolt by some dervishes, led by a man who declared himself to be the Mahdi, the Messiah. The dervishes were heavily influenced, of course, by Sufi philosophy, but that's probably a time for a separate video. The upshot was that Gordon returned to Sudan, still determined as a result of his Christian faith to eradicate slavery once and for all in that part of Africa. The dervishes, who were the inhabitants, wished to extend slavery and began even capturing fellow Muslims and making slaves of them. It was as a result of the struggle of the British to end slavery in Africa that Gordon was killed in Khartoum. This is not a perspective which you will hear mentioned very often these days, because it doesn't fit in at all well with the modern mythology which is built up around the British Empire. The fact is that the Africans in Sudan were determined to continue trading in black slaves from sub-Saharan Africa, and the British, as represented by men like General Gordon, were passionately committed to the abolition of slavery at all costs. The whole idea that the British were intent only upon their own profit when operating in Africa is nonsense. They seized Zanzibar for the same reason that Gordon went to Sudan, to stop the slave trade there. The colonies and protectorates in Africa were not profitable to Britain. South Africa was a money-making concern because of the gold and diamonds there. but elsewhere the African colonies cost more to run than any profit Britain made on the resources found in them. The struggle to put an end to slavery was at the back of most of Britain's activity in East Africa. In short, the Africans in Zanzibar, Sudan, Somalia and so on were very enthusiastic about maintaining the slave trade, but the British were only ever interested in putting a stop to it. General Gordon was a martyr in this struggle, until a few decades ago was revered by the British as a hero. It's only in the last few years that men like him have come to be regarded as villains.